business owner stuck in fear, doubt, and worry about what the marketplace will look like in the future? Then this show is for you. Strap on your seatbelt and get ready to disrupt and innovate. Here's your host, Lisa Levy.
It is my great pleasure to welcome Doug C. Brown. He is the CEO of CEO Sales Strategies and a globally recognized sales revenue and profit growth expert. Doug has advised companies like Intuit, CBS, Procter & Gamble, and Enterprise, and once helped Tony Robbins and Chet Holmes boost a division's sales by 864%. That's what the number says, 864% in just 6 months. Today, he helps organizations and individuals tap into top 1% sales strategies through his academies and masterminds, and he builds high-performing, often commission-only sales teams that actually deliver. Get ready to rethink what's possible for revenue, profit, and sales performance. Doug, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks for having me here. I'm so grateful. Hey, you made me sound somewhat important, so I appreciate that.
Everybody who comes on this show is highly important because we're all doing something that is impacting business growth and capability, and that is what drives our economy and what is so incredibly important. And it is not about enterprise, Fortune 500, Fortune 10 companies. It's about the mid-market and SMB. And so it is really important that we talk a little bit today, Doug, about what it is that you're doing and why it's important now.
Yeah, primarily, I'm really focused on EBITDA and focused on multiplication of EBITDA from pretty much I would say the lower mid market, from the 10 to $100 million. Although I do help companies that are less in revenue. But what we're doing is essentially we're predictably growing their revenue and building out systems and processes for doing that, as well as reducing the operational expenses as well as the expenses in the company. And therefore, we get a higher EBITDA, which is generally the benchmark which most investors, not all, or most people want to buy a company. So it increases the valuation of the company, gives the owner more cash to work with, even if the owner's been like bootstrapping it along and they're like, man, I can't wait till I make a little bit more money. We can usually free up that money. So essentially what we do is we end up giving more profit to the company and cash flow to the company, which is the big benchmark that people who look at companies to buy. So sometimes people desire to exit the company, but they haven't set the company up correctly. And I do that through all the other methodologies of helping with the sales teams and the process and all the metrics and math that come behind that.
So let's start with a couple of really basic things because I hate making assumptions because you know what that means, right?
Yes.
Let's not do that. And so let's talk to the audience just for a minute and define EBITDA and really what it is and why, what a good target is.
Yeah. So the target will depend on what your outcomes that you're looking for are, and based on industry averages. I don't like even industry averages because we get to blow them out of the water sometimes. So that's a lot of fun. But EBITDA is basically, it really is a measure of cash flow in the company. And a lot of people, so it's earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, amortization, right? And so if you back out the tax, the depreciation, the amortization, you end up with the earnings before, right? And that's really what is considered more cash flow in the business, because all the other factors could be variable. Well, I mean, all factors could be variable, but these, like, someone may know how to structure their taxes differently and be able to get a lower tax rate. Right. So when people look at a company to buy it, they do look at that, but it's not necessarily a consideration, because unless they know how to reduce that tax rate, right, then they go, okay, I can give this much for the company, because they haven't figured that out. And so if you're depreciating things like business assets or buildings, or you're amortizing certain things over a period of time, those are really highly variable in a lot of ways. So what I do is I essentially give the company more cash flow, and I improve the position of that cash flow so that they can use that for more, things, if you will. Sometimes reducing expenses in a certain category can kick up the actual cash flow or the valuation by the business, 9, 10%. it's just one of those things where we look at both sides of the coin. A lot of people say, hey, let's just raise sales. Well, that's cool, but how about raising margins too? And that way you can usually be able to do more because you have the additional cash.
Absolutely. And in that little hidden gem, right? We all know that revenue can hide a lot of things. But if we actually improve margin, we don't have to hide things anymore. We're operating more efficiently, we're
Yeah.
operating more effectively, and those margins are actually probably more important than increasing revenue.
Yeah, and again, it depends on the positioning, Lisa, that a company's looking for, right? So like if I'm an owner and I want to hold the business, I want more profit than revenue generally, right? Because I want to use the money. Maybe I want to build a new home, or maybe I want to hire more people and whatever. And I'm not so worried about, trying to say, oh, I'm a $80 million company, the old adage, like, would you like a $1 million company at 100% profit, or a $10 million company at 5% profit, right? Um, so depends on what they're looking for. But if they are looking for like exit valuation, increasing revenues a good idea, as well as increasing the margin of that, the EBITDA, improving the EBITDA level. Because if you take a valuation, let's say a company's getting X, right? And they're, I don't know, a $20 million company, they have 20% EBITDA today. They got $4 million and they can get X on the EBITDA, because the average company is like usually around 4.6. So if we say around 5, then, you got $4 million, that company's probably going to sell for around $20 million. But if we can increase that EBITDA from 20 to 25%, let's say, right? Now we've got that extra cash to work with. So, if you have a $20 million company that now goes from 4 million to 5 million, and you're still getting that 5x, now you're getting 25 million versus 20 million for that company. So therefore, we've increased the by that $1 million, which multiplies out times 5x. Now your revenue might have only gone up X%, but the EBIT has gone up. And, so essentially you get to work with more money. You got that extra $1 million. And if we're reducing expenses at the same time, we're increasing that revenue or that EBITDA multiple, magical things kind of poke their head out and go, hey, we can do this, we can, those type of things. And usually just, money doesn't solve every problem, I've learned, Lisa, but it does arrive, to quote Tony Robbins, it does allow you to arrive at your problems in style, that type of thing.
And arriving at our problems in style is not a bad way to arrive at our problems. You were talking about the overall approach that you take with your clients and, talking about systems and processes and, growing the business while reducing the operating costs. Talk to us a little bit about the system, your approach and how you engage with your clients.
Yeah. So it depends on what they need. Like I'm talking with a company that's doing $3.5 million. They just bought a new company that's doing $3.5 million, I should say. And they're more concerned about, I don't have a sales team. How do I install one and do it the right way? Right. So, you know, depends on what they're looking for, but and I work a lot, which I love working with consultants, so the solo entrepreneur consultants, and they're looking, how do I increase my personal income coming through the door? So in that case, whether you're working with a sales team or a consultant or a smaller company, it's all about certain types of metrics. I call them the big 11, if you will. But they can be less than 11, but usually we're looking at how many outreaches are we doing, how many connections we making, responses we getting, appointment setting ratio, appointments to closes, closes to follow-up closes, follow-up, closes to increase transactional value, whether it's upsell, downsell, cross-sell. We look at how do we extend our current relationship into referrals, what people would call referrals, but new clients. What's our follow-up like? How are we regenerating a new sale, increasing buying frequency, all of those things. Those are some main metrics that anybody can, if they just measure the ratio and metrics between the two. And if you're a larger company, a little bit more established, or even if you're not, there are other metrics to look at in the process, How do we improve our communication, our ideal right fit buyer? So the methodology that I developed, which I have deployed in many, many, many companies, starts with first, what's the truthful goal we're trying to achieve? And believe it or not, that one is, that's challenging the norms for most people, as really when it comes down to it.
Well, and let's sit with this a little bit because that is a really simple statement that has some really powerful implications, right? What is the truthful goal? Right? So on one hand, right, the truthful goal is they are trying to close a deal and generate revenue, income, and profit for their business.
Yeah.
They're also trying to solve, if we're talking about a consulting organization, some sort of a problem for a customer. We're talking about a product sale. They're still trying to solve a problem with a widget for somebody somewhere.
Mhm.
But what is the truthful goal that you're looking for in all of that?
I want to know, we're here today. Where do we want to be in a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, that type of thing? I don't go out very long, 1 to 3 years tops, because things change. So here's how I look at it and how I explain it. And it's kind of a strange explanation, but people get it, right? So let's say two people meet and they're interested in one another. What is the outcome for that whole relationship? Do they want to get married and have a family, so to speak? That is one goal. If one wants to get married and have children and the other doesn't want to get married, that's not really a good relationship. Now, if two people get together and they say, hey, I do want to get married together, I want to have this many children out of the relationship, I would like to have this type of lifestyle, I'd like to have, and they lay it all out on paper and they both sit and they both agree and they go, is this really what we want? If not, we need to change it. And they make some adjustments and changes and they come up with, let's say, a contract which says this is exactly what we want. And they both, I don't know, prick their left finger and put blood stains on the agreement and they say, this is where we're going. That's it. Um, because we both truthfully want this. That's a great match. But for some reason, when it comes to business, people, let's say they're doing, I don't know, $5 million a year. Well, I just talked to a gentleman just recently. He was doing $7 million a year. He's in the heating and air conditioning, the HVAC business. And I said to him, I said, well, what's your truthful goal? He goes, I want to hit 12 million. And I said, okay, why 12 million? He goes, I don't know. It's just a good number. And I said, so isn't 40? Nice round number 40, right? He goes, no, 12 million. And I said, okay, well, what do you want out of that 12 million? He goes, I have no idea. I said, well, when do you want it? He goes, I want to hit this. Now, this was a month ago. So what's that, October?
Sure.
And I said, when do you want to be there? And he said, by the end of this year. And I said, so you want to go from 7 to 12 million by the end of this year? He said, yes. I said, what marketing budget or budget do you have wrapped around this, your plan? He goes, well, I don't really have one right now. I'm like, okay. I said, that's a pretty big stroke of growth going on, within 3 months. I said, I never say never. I know people who have won the lottery. Like, it happens. So there's always a small percentage of chance that it could happen. But I asked him this question. I said, what if you only get from 7 to 8 in that period of time? He goes, that's okay too. So the truthful goal is not 12, right? So, to the extreme one time, I had somebody who was doing like $3 million a year and he said he wanted to get to 52 million in the next year. And I said, well, okay, you want to lay out a plan? He goes, yeah. And we started laying out the plan. And I'm like, based on your goals, you're going to need 5 million in marketing money, to come up with, covering the outreach that you say you want to make to get that goal, to get these conversion rates, all these things. And I just did it very quickly for him. And he goes, oh, no, 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 that's too much. So what it really came down to was he had a goal pie in the sky, Lisa.
Hmm.
But when it comes down to the truthful goal of what we're willing to do, most people are very unclear about those two things. Firstly, they're unclear about what the real goal is, the truthful goal. And secondly, they're unclear whether or not they actually want to do that work to get there. So what I always try to do is scope in that goal very clearly. And I try to keep it conservative for people. Even if we blow it out of the water, that's great. But what is the dead drop goal, the truthful goal that no matter what, we've got to hit that. And so just like the marriage, if you don't hit that, there's going to be discord in the marriage and then there's going to be problems, right? So that's what the step number one is always. And I know it sounds, excuse me, kind of basic, but the reality is if we don't get that nailed down, there's so many companies just out there doing so many things that they just don't want to do. They're just out there selling, right? So, and they're bringing in clients they don't want. And so they're having more problems, more stress, more, time management issues, all these things that are happening because we never started with that number one point. And then we build out from there.
And thank you for sharing the story and the elaboration on it because, right, the $12 million, right, that was an aspirational goal, right? That is the wouldn't it be nice if, and this is almost like hitting the lottery and all of those things, and oh my gosh, fantastic. But aspirational goals without a plan behind it remain aspirational. And it's really what are you willing to invest in? We have time, we have effort, we have finite resources that we can get from point A to point B and being able to allocate those to something that is truthful, that is attainable. And even if that goal, in your words, feels a little bit conservative, right? But it is attainable. And that is, I think, a really critical thing that business owners and leaders need to keep track of. Trust me, I would love to see 20 million in revenue. I have no path to get there today. In 18 months, that could be a different story. But right now, a truthful, realistic goal is not that number. So when you're working through the teams with their systems and their processes and helping them, what are some of the tell me a story about a time when things went sideways, it went off the rail. You brought it back because, ultimately those are the things that we do. But, take me through it hurt a little bit, but the success was worth it story.
How much time do you have? There's so many experiences like that. About 6 years ago, I was in that position that most people want to be in, right? Everything's paid off, plentiful money in the bank, plentiful money coming in. And I ended up one day, my wife at the time came to me and said, I don't want to be here anymore. And she was half owner of the company at the same time. So, and then she said, I want 70% minimum. And I was like, wait a minute. So I'm like, what? On a personal note, I'm like, what did I do? And she's like, nothing. I just decided I want a change of life. And I'm like, so that went into a really big legal battle, right? And in retrospect, I probably should have just given her the 70% or at least negotiated down to 60, right? Because we literally liquidated down everything we had in the battle. And through that battle, I ended up with the company less than it was less than $80,000 in the bank. Now, for some of people going, well, that's not too bad. You still have 80 grand, trying to make payroll and, do everything you need to do. And so it was a very bleak, I would say, it was about a bleak 60 days after that decree came through and everything was finalized and everything was paid off. And, looking back on it, it cost millions and millions of dollars to go through that process, right? That's why I'm saying I would probably have been better off just giving her 60% and kept, millions and millions of dollars, right? Sometimes as human beings, we don't think through things the way we're supposed to, right? And so here I am. I've got 2 kids now that I'm taking care of, and I've got this 70 something thousand dollars and payroll, and I'm watching the bank drop, payroll. And I had to, because of everything was going on, we were backing off on certain clients because the more we made, the more the attorneys were getting and all that good stuff, right? So long story short, we just kind of flattened the thing out. Then I had to figure out, okay, how do I get money back in the bank quickly? And I was only at that point, I was like, how do I just get a few $100,000 like back in the bank account so I can I can make payroll without having to pull on credit cards or do all this other stuff.
Mhm.
Now, I've been there in my life before where through no fault of our own, in some regards, I could say maybe part of that was my fault because I was part of the party, like government regulation came in, changed the industry, just, took out, the whole industry for whatever reason, right? I've been through those things before. So what I did is I started saying, okay, what do we do before to recover from these things? And this is the value of wisdom. This is the value of going through those times that could be challenging moments in your life. And I remembered listening to Ted Turner at one time. He was losing $20 million a day, and he turned that around. And I said, if Ted Turner can turn around a $20 million a day loss, I think I can do this. And so what I decided was get right back to work and focus on everything I teach brand new companies up to $1 million to do. Nothing matters but sales. Nothing. And we ended up picking up a couple of clients, and one of the clients we picked up wanted to do a sales campaign. And so I put a team together around that sales campaign. And in 6 weeks, so it took us almost 2 months to the day, and then 6 weeks from that period of time, we generated $860,000 commissions out of that client. We ended up doing 1.4 million before the end of the year. So that started from March, and we did 1.45 million by the end of the end of December. And so, the plan was focus on sales and only on sales, Lisa. So that was something that was a challenging moment where I think, we bounced back and we did more than the following year. And, we survived the process. And the crazy part is that like COVID hit, but because we were positioned well with certain clients and they were doing things mostly digital, our business actually expanded due to that process. So that is probably the most recent one that I can tell you that happened to me. But it's in the downtimes that you figure out what you're really made of. That's what I found out in life. I learned that in the military. In the military, I learned you could sustain almost anything for 6 months.
Yes.
And so, I just kind of dug through that process. And that's what I recommend people doing. You can always find people who have done this and fallen and come back, figure out what they've done. Just, make it your own and deploy it. It usually comes back faster for you than you figured it would for them because they're the pioneers of the process, right? So,
Right. Absolutely. Doug, if what you've talked about today resonates with the audience, how do they learn more? Where do they go?
so they can go reach out to me by email is probably the best. It's Doug at CEO salesstrategies.com. So plural on the sales strategies. Doug Brown 123 is my LinkedIn. Sometimes people reach out to me there. Can I give something away?
Please.
So I developed this methodology and we called it the 2X methodology. And quite frankly, it was because we were like 10X. That's kind of a joke. No. Well, if you think about it, if somebody can bench press 100 pounds, you don't throw 1,000 pounds on the bar that first day. Right. And that's what people were promoting, that 10X process. Like you can do it all in one day. It's like, no, 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 no. I've been a part of building companies up, rapidly. We grew from 68 million to 368 million in 2 years. And that company eventually sold off for $2 billion. And I can tell you that took 5 years to get there before we even got that rapid growth, right? So it's, can it happen? Yeah. But, Zoom, everybody knows it, but it didn't happen overnight. The pandemic caused the growth of Zoom. I'd like to give away the 2X. The 2X is a methodology that we actually developed, which is a series of seven major stages that anybody can deploy to actually raise their revenue. So just go to ceosalesstrategies.com/, the number 2X. So /2X. It's and you can get access to the video course that I put together.
Fantastic. Doug, thank you so much for that. And the link, we'll put that in the show notes to make it easy for people to find it. In our conversation today, we have gone through the reality that cash flow is really important when we're talking about the EBITDA and getting to good numbers so that we can increase valuations. Everything starts with EB, earnings before all of the other things. And that is critical so that we can get to the revenue and the margins so that we can have a nice exit and actually add value to an owner on their way out. But through this whole experience, Doug is also talking to us about the power of sales and sales and sales and sales and sales. And if you didn't get that, sales is where everything starts. He shared with us the idea of big 11 metrics, some of those around outreaches, appointments to closes, how you're upselling, how your referrals are working. The metrics matter, and knowing what they are and keeping track of them makes a real difference. We talked a little bit about truthful goals and actually understanding what it is you need to achieve, not what you want to achieve, not what you hope to achieve, not what wouldn't it be great if I could, but what you actually need to truthfully. Talking a little bit in that about how we should and probably form our personal relationships and getting to those right matches was a fantastic analogy. In a movie I saw over the weekend, and I'll tell you, it was not a great movie, and I don't even remember what it was called, but the comment was, "The successful outcome of a first date is not a second date." It's somebody who's gonna be there with you when you're old and wrinkled and getting ready to plan your actual exit. So knowing what your truthful goals are and how they align are absolutely critical. Doug, thank you for your time and your insights and the generous offer. And audience members, you know my rules. Don't get left behind. Join me next time.
That's it for today's episode of Disrupt and Innovate.